We've got 12 people have answered the poll. Remember, if you're here, we've got 25 people here. If you're here, answer the poll, because that just gives me an indication of where people are. So excellent. All right. And it looks like we've got people. I've got 11 questions. So yeah, it looks like about a quarter of you are studying the French Revolution. 3/4 aren't there yet, which then again, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an issue if we talk about the French Revolution, a preview. But let's see what the questions are. Remember, look at questions that other people asked and upvote if you have the same question. Hey, Carter. So as far as what we've got here, okay, can I explain the three main groups of the French society and their roles? Okay, so if we look at what's called the old regime, now I have got a lot of videos on this. I've got Through the Reign of Terror. I've got like this really like epic series on the French Revolution. I'm sure Emily's probably seen some of those. And so as far as that goes, I've got it all the way through the Reign of Terror, where I take like very specific, like almost microscopic looks at the French Revolution. So a lot of times I'll refer you to these videos. I've also got a series about women and the French Revolution that could be helpful to you. So as far as this goes, this would be my video on the old regime. Okay, so the old regime is kind of how things were before the French Revolution. Now, what's important about the old regime is, first of all, understanding that you've got these three estates. Okay, the first estate, which God first. Okay, so the church is the first estate, the nobility being the second estate, and the third estate being everyone else. Now, the third estate, that's about 97% of the population. Now, it may not be an exact figure, but I usually say 97% versus 3% that were in these privileged orders. Now, I've got this this graphic that I'm working on that I'll hopefully get that and do a video specifically. I want to go back, since I've got this narrative nearly finished of the French Revolution. Hey, Eddie. I was saying narrative and then I saw Eddie, but yes, hey, Eddie. And so since I've almost got my narrative of the French Revolution done, then I'll go back and do like some topical videos, like these are the classes of the French Revolution. So the thing is, you've got the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate. But what's important is that we're looking at it as far as the third estate, 97% of the population. You've got really three different groups in the third estate. You've got the bourgeoisie, Bourgeoisie, which my teacher in high school said that when he was in high school, he looked at it and he said Bourgeoisie. Now, it's a written test. If it makes you feel better to say Bourgeoisie, you're going to spell it better that way, okay? So whatever. But if you're in polite conversation, learn to say bourgeoisie better than me, because I'm not very good at speaking French, as people who watch my videos know. But you've got the bourgeoisie. Now, this was probably only about 8 to 10% of the population. This is, oh, y'all are funny. Okay, so 8 to 10% of the population, and this is the professional class. Now, a lot of people say middle class, but I don't try to use that term, because in the United States, what is the middle class? Like nearly everybody in the United States considers themselves to be part of the middle class, and we're really looking at, with the bourgeoisie, what I'd call the professional class. Okay, these are people with white collar jobs, people who are, attorneys, physicians, merchants. These are people who tend to be educated, and they tend to have money. All right, and so that's one class of people. And then, oh well, good, David, thank you. And then you've got the sans-culottes, okay, sans-culottes. And so these are the people. Now, sans-culottes means without breeches, okay? Any of you who are wearing pants right now, which it's getting to be toward the winter time, so I would definitely recommend wearing pants. If you're wearing regular pants, that's sans-culottes, okay? Now, the bourgeoisie, they were likely to have on breeches, and that's like when you look at paintings of the founding fathers, where they've got, those, or some of y'all who are into the Hamilton musical. That's a lot of people are into that. So yes, definitely wear pants. That's a good thing. But the breeches, which are like, they go to your knee, and then you wear stockings with them. Okay, so you've got breeches and then you wear stockings. Now, the sans-culottes, they just wore long pants, because the bourgeoisie in their dress, they're trying to imitate the nobility. is what they're trying to do. They're trying to dress like the nobility, look like the nobility, act like the nobility. Now, the sans-culottes, these are the people that I would call the they're the working class, the urban working class, shopkeepers, laborers, artisans, and the like. And then we've got to remember the peasantry, all right? And really, the peasantry is the largest group in France. Now, remember that the peasantry also includes, okay, in addition to, like, it's not just people who are working on the Lord's manor. The peasantry also includes farmers that own their own land and stuff like that. So that's something like out in the French countryside, and that's what I really want to explore in this next segment that I want to put together on the French Revolution, on the war in the Vendée, because there was actually in some places some armed resistance to the French Revolution. There were people that when Louis XVI was killed, they took that very personally. That was their king, and their king has been murdered. And so this is something that, they view this government is illegitimate, this government that tried to replace their priests that wouldn't swear an oath to the state with priests that would. And so there were people who were very tied into these traditions, because France is, one thing, France is a beautiful country, all right? But typically when we think about France, we think about Paris, but France has so much rural land and remained rural. Like when we get to the Industrial Revolution, France stayed rural for a long time. So let's not forget about the peasantry. And so when you think about like the bourgeoisie, the white collar workers, the educated class, the class with money, then the sans-culottes, the urban working class and laboring class. And then you've got the peasantry. They've got different interests, okay? So for one, and I love talking about this in the light of the elections, like in political parties in the United States. Like if you want to understand the whole thing about, the blue wave that they were predicting didn't quite happen the way people forecasted, right? The Democrats, maybe they picked up 35 to 40 seats. We're still tallying a few votes here and there. But the Democrats made a lot of gains with college educated districts, like basically suburban college educated districts. And so these are people who have typically voted Republican before Donald Trump. And so Donald Trump's presidency, what has happened is that the Republicans have lost like some of this bourgeois support, in the bourgeoisie, these people who are college educated, work white collar jobs, and some of those people are voting Democratic. Whereas what's happened here is that, Donald Trump has picked up, like there are people who are voting Republican. Like if you want to understand the difference between the House races and the Senate race. Now, the Democrats were defending a tough Senate map, but at the same time, even like in Ohio and Florida, people showed up to vote in the rural areas. Like Donald Trump has done very well among like what we would call the modern peasantry, like the people who live in rural areas. And so we see that, as we look at the current political landscape, you can see how, the Republican Party and this realignment that's going on right now, we see the differences in interest and voting patterns of the bourgeoisie. Now, not to say that people, that are college educated aren't voting Republican or something like that, but typically college educated Americans, like that's not including like grad school educated, but people with a 4-year college degree, they have traditionally tended to vote Republican. So remember that the third estate is not just one big group, okay, 97% of the country. Now, good question on what caused the French Revolution. Now, as far as that goes, let me address this aristocratic resurgence. Okay, so as far as the aristocratic resurgence that Emily is talking about here, that Louis XIV, absolutism is naturally undermining the aristocracy. Okay, now in some places you're co-opting, like if you look at Prussia and Russia, putting the nobles into service. Okay, so basically in Prussia, the nobility turned into the military aristocracy, and even going to World War II. I mean, in Hitler's army, there were still some of these old aristocratic Prussian generals with the fawn in front of their name. And so this certainly, became a thing, this whole idea of a service nobility. And if you're in the nobility, you're rendering military service. Now, Louis XIV, brought more bourgeoisie into the royal administration and into the civil service and the government. And so Louis XIV's tenure was something that, that lessen the power of the nobility. Now, Louis XV was not as strong of a king, and he made concessions to the nobility. And so you have this aristocratic resurgence that basically, even though the Estates General is not being called during Louis XV's time, the nobility are reasserting themselves. And so what happens is that at the outset of the French Revolution, like when we get to the Assembly of Notables, okay, so in 1787, now 1789 is our big year where you've got the Estates General, but 1787 is the year of the Assembly of Notables. And what happens here is that we've mentioned the three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate. And so the clergy and the nobility were tax exempt. Now, if you look back at the Middle Ages, there was a reason for that. Now, even today, like when we look at, we have tax exempt religious organizations today, but religious organizations in the United States, like the church, owns the land that the church is on. The church doesn't operate farms and businesses and all of that. The church was the largest landowner in France, paid no taxes. So you've got all of this land that's not taxed. Now, remember, in England, Henry VIII seized the monasteries and abolished holy orders and got the church. Henry VIII seized the monasteries and the orders and all of that. So took church property. But France in 1787, 1789, they still, the church owns all of this land and no one is paying taxes on it. So the French, while we could talk about the extravagance of Versailles and the extravagance of the French court. The French court wasn't the only extravagant court. The French had more of a revenue problem than a spending problem. And so what was going on was, when the French monarchy was on the verge of collapse, then they, as far as financially, they called the nobility and the clergy in. And in the Middle Ages, I can understand under the feudal system why the nobility wouldn't pay taxes, okay? Because the nobility were called upon to, I need 30 mounted knights. I'm going to war. Okay, I'm bringing them there. That's kind of like their taxes. But at this point, where France has become more centralized, there's no national utility to the nobles not paying taxes. Like, for example, and that's I always forget this number, but let me just go in here because a lot of times in this country we hear complaints about the 1% or the 5%, they're not paying their fair share in taxes, but then we see how much they're actually paying in taxes, and it's it's a lot that they're paying in taxes. So as far as that is concerned, this thing's opening. It's opening. It's opening. Come on. You can open here. Excellent. Good job here. So the top 1% pay 38% of the taxes. Okay. So when you think about it, 1% of the population is paying over a third of the taxes in the United States today. And if we look at the top 5%, okay, the top five, the majority of income taxes, of personal income taxes in the United States, are paid by the top 5%. So if we think about that, the nobility, a lot of the nobility were the wealthier people in France, then if you think about like these people being exempt, that's a lot when you consider that 1% of people pays a third of the taxes. So the Assembly of Notables was an attempt by the French government to get the church and the nobility to voluntarily give up their prerogatives, to say that we are, and that's where you kind of think about like nationalism, that this idea that, you know what, I'm willing to lay down, my privilege at the feet of the nation, okay? Because my king needs me, my nation needs me, and I'm willing to give up this privilege. But what happened at the Assembly of Notables was that the nobility and the clerk, they would not give up their privilege, and they said that we are not giving up a thing without calling the Estates General. Now, the French Revolution is full of, what I reference, what I call, it's not like I made this up. This is a thing. The law of unintended consequences. Okay. So there are a lot of times, what are we talking about? Okay. Yeah. Whatever he's talking about there. But anyway, yes. The 1%, they have more money, but that's the thing. Imagine if the 1% weren't paying any taxes at all. Then what would that do to government revenue? It would sink it quite a bit. And so the thing is that the nobility are the clergy and the nobility are really kind of signing their own death warrant, because they overplayed their hand. They thought, we're in a position of strength. We've had this resurgence. And so they're going to, I don't disagree with that. But I don't think that classes of people should be tax exempt. All right. So as far as that, my goodness, okay. Sometimes I'm making a reference to like present day like realities and stuff. Like I'm not trying to like start like some kind of debate in the chat. Okay, y'all, let's try to stay focused on the French Revolution. All right. There we go. You see? All right. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, was just trying to provide an example, not necessarily start like excuse me. Oh my goodness. All right. I think I'm allergic to, thank you. I think I'm allergic to current politics. All right. So as far as that goes, that's the Assembly of Notables, and then they call the Estates General. And so that's really like, if they would have just agreed to pay taxes, then we would, European history would be a lot less interesting, wouldn't it? And so as far as that goes, what caused the French Revolution? Now, several things we could say caused the French Revolution. First of all, I would say that the financial crisis that was, oh my goodness, John Brown, come on now. All right. This is electronic. I'm not in front of you. You're not going to get sick. And it might even be allergies. I don't know. But anyway, thank you. But as far as, see, when I was in school, like when I was growing up, you could cough and you could sneeze into your hand. And then the government started saying like, sneeze into your elbow. And I'm like, I don't have to do that just because the government tells me to. So there you go. I've got some classical liberal sympathies, I suppose. But first of all, I would say the financial crisis. All right. So the financial crisis happens, and a lot of that is due to the French support for the American Revolution, which goes into 18th century warfare, the balance of power, that basically, because Britain had taken away France's colonies in the 7 Years' War, France is like, you know what? We're going to finance these Americans who are going to take away Britain's colonies. So yeah, there you go. And France basically cut off their nose to spite their face. And so as far as that's concerned, that's one thing, is the financial crisis. Another thing I would say is Louis the 16th. I think there's certainly a case to be made, that Louis the 16th was not the man for the time. Louis the 16th made a lot of really bad decisions. If Louis the 16th had been more decisive at certain points, or if he just kind of gone along with the revolution, it's like the National Assembly, gets together and they say, oh, we're going to make our own thing here. We're not going to do the Estates General, and we're going to write a constitution for France, and we're not leaving. Now, Louis XIV probably would have had them all arrested at that point. But Louis XVI is like, okay, whatever. And, kind of like what I did on Instagram yesterday with that meme. I said, weird flex, but okay. And Louis went along with it, and then he brought troops to Versailles. And so it's like, why did you do that? Louis consented to doubling the third in the Estates General, but not to vote by head, which is like, why have twice as many angry third estate delegates who then only vote as a group? It makes no sense. Then, of course, Louis tried in the flight to Varennes. He tried to escape from Paris. And it's like, Louis, what are you thinking? So that would be another one. Then I would go into Enlightenment philosophy. So first of all, I would say that the attacks on the church during the French Revolution, that those would not have been possible if not for Enlightenment philosophy increasing the amount of religious skepticism, especially among the more educated classes, that the church did not occupy the same positions it once did. Now, that is in the cities, mind you, that's not in the countryside. There are still today in France plenty of conservative Catholics in France, especially in rural areas. And so as far as that, you've got Enlightenment philosophy. That also, I would put classical liberalism in with Enlightenment philosophy. This idea that government exists to protect natural rights, that government should be limited, that there shouldn't be these legal privileges. So classical liberalism, which you could put it on its own or under the heading of Enlightenment philosophy. I would also mention nationalism. Okay, so all right. Oh gosh, some of y'all, do y'all do the live streams? I'll be right back. 1 second. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So as far as that goes, that classical liberalism, certainly, and then nationalism. All right, nationalism is something, because then people are starting to think like, we want to build a French nation. Now, although President Macron was, classical, I mean, yeah, anyway, oh gosh, y'all are so funny. But President Macron at the ceremonies over the weekend blasted nationalism. And it's like, when Donald Trump said, like, when he tweeted yesterday that the France is like the most nationalistic like nation in the country, in a lot of ways, I mean, he's got a point. Like, there's, France was like basically the birthplace of nationalism. So this idea that we should look at ourselves as a nation and not a states. Okay, so that would, oh gosh, y'all are saying, and there's this person in the live streams, like this, like really like rabid, like anti-Catholic, who swears that I'm a Jesuit. It's really funny in those live streams, and that person comes in there. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, so those would be things that I would put under that sort of umbrella there. So that's what I've got for that. And then was Louis XVI. And see, that's the thing, Emily, that Louis was indecisive. Okay, I think Louis, like, really, to say that Louis supported or didn't support anything would be a stretch, because it's very difficult to find him making decisions, which I would say is one of the reasons that the French Revolution happened the way it did, because Louis was unwilling or unable to provide leadership. In his younger years, Louis was physically impotent. As king, he was impotent as a king, as a leader. So not strong leadership there. Eddie, you mean Kanye 2024, don't you? Okay, so then what do you think should be included? Okay, now this is yeah, the counter-revolutionaries, Emily, this is what I want to, and I just want to do it right. I don't want to rush it. And every time for an episode of this French Revolution series, it's I don't want to rush it. And the war in the Vendée, Vendee. Now, this is something that is really, really interesting. Okay, yeah. So, I mean, I want to do this justice, okay, because it is like basically here's the thing that like in the Vendée you had now in certain areas of France you had like a grain shortage and there was a crisis, but just imagine like the Vendée is like this place where it was this rural region of France where everything was working okay. All right. So the idea, like if you look at the American Civil War, for example, creative destruction, that it's like, as the nation, it's like the United States was on one hand on the verge of really industrializing, and on the other hand, you had this entire region that was still using slave agriculture. And in France, it was in some ways kind of similar that you had an area here that, and it wasn't the only area, but an area where it was working. It's like people love the church. It's like their priests were a lot of times they grew up there and their priest cared about them. Like you look at the civil constitution of the clergy and it just like assumes that all these priests and bishops are absentee and corrupt. And no, it's like these priests were doing their job. They were valued members of the community. These people looked up to their local nobility. And what happened when these peasants, like what happened is, and this connects to the French Revolutionary Wars, is that basically the French have to employ what's called a levy en masse, that they are building these mass armies, not just these mass armies. It's not just professional soldiers, that these soldiers that are coming in to France are professional soldiers, the Prussians, the Austrians, and the French are responding with these less disciplined but much larger and much more patriotic armies that are going out there. And so as far as that goes, like in order to do that, you've got to go out and conscript people from the countryside. And so these people would come into came into the Vendée to recruit people. And these peasants are like, look, these people, they killed our king. They've taken away our priest with the civil constitution of the clergy, because the Vendée was in one of those areas where you had a very high percentage of refractory priests, of priests that would not swear the oath. And so therefore, they were not allowed legally to continue to be priests. And remember that, they're getting rid of state collected mandatory tithes and stuff like that. And so, these people, the way they see it is these people in Paris, they've taken away our priests, they've killed our king, and now they want us to go fight for them. And so what they did is they went to the local nobility and they said that we want you to lead a rebellion. So it's not just like a peasant revolt, but it was a peasant revolt that, they wanted their nobles to lead. That is your job. And Henri de la Rochechouart, okay, I don't speak very good French. Henri de la Rochechouart. And he was 21 years old. And so he, now I would be glad to talk, ladies and gentlemen, I would be glad to, do like personal, talks like at another point. If y'all aren't here for AP European history, like I'm going to politely ask y'all to leave, like go to Reddit or wherever, y'all go, or, poll or wherever some of y'all are, hanging out. But we had a little bit of a problem in one of these things last week, but let's not go there. Let's make sure that we are all right. But I mean, I'd love to talk to you some other time, but we are trying to talk about European history. So I will have to start kicking people if it gets to be a problem. Okay. But I'm seeing the chat is just it lacks relevance to what we're talking about. But I would be glad to answer those questions in another forum sometime. All right. So getting back into that, Rochechouart is 21 years old, and he ends up being shouldered with the task of leading this peasant army, because and the thing is, they don't think like, hey, this guy's just 21 years old. It's like, this guy's a nobleman. that's what noblemen do. And to me, like, it's just there's some beauty in this, because if you think about it, the nobility, like, we naturally see them as the bad guys or something. Like, there's kind of this tendency to, like, oh, that's the old regime, that's bad. And it's like, well, really, it's just that's the old regime, that's different, that's how they lived. And so that they look to this 21-year-old basically boy and say, you need to lead us because you are of noble birth. That's really something beautiful. And he ended up being killed by some French soldiers who were pretending they were pretending to surrender to him, and then they shot him, and his men buried him right there, and they continued to resist for some time. And so there was definitely resistance here and there to the to the French Revolution and what was going on with that. So yeah, the counter-revolutionaries, I think that's, and then of course with the French Revolutionary Wars, you've got, with the September massacres and other things that are going on, this whole idea that they're enemies of the people right here. And that's where you get into some of this like really radical nationalism, that nationalism is about like, look, this is what the general will is, and there are some people who aren't going along with that. They're not a part of us, that they are internal enemies. And that's where, I mean, I think that there are certainly examples of good nationalism, but there are also examples of kind of a, toxic nationalism as well. So it's like nationalism in and of itself is not, I mean, it's neither good nor bad. It's just depending on what's done with it. And the Girondins and the Montagnards. Now, both, I mean, you don't have to get too deep into this in a survey level course. They're both originally part of the whole Jacobin movement. Now, the Jacobins are Republicans. So when we think about the Jacobins, these are the people who favor a republic. They want to get rid of the monarchy. Now, the Montagnards, the mountain, they're the most radical because they sit in the high seats there. Now, the Girondins, they wanted to see they wanted to see a republic, but the big dispute came with the trial of Louis XVI, that the Girondins didn't want to execute him, the Montagnards did. So then, once Louis executed, the French Republic's proclaimed and all of that, then they start to cannibalize themselves, and the Montagnards take out the Girondins, and then finally the Montagnards go after each other and themselves. That is the 1830 revolution in Les Mis. So yeah, like almost every year in Euro, when I get to the French Revolution, somebody like, oh, Mr. Ritchie, can we watch Les Mis? It's like, not that French Revolution. The 1831 that you barely spend any time on in AP Euro, that barely gets any mention. All right. So as far as that goes, so Emily, as far as when we get into the directory, the bourgeoisie is really resuming control. Okay, it's kind of it's a cooling off period. The Thermidorian reaction. Okay, this is this is basically, okay, this radicalism is over. Now, they don't go back. I mean, after the Thermidorian reaction, they keep using the French Republican calendar for several years. It's not until Napoleon takes over, and some years after, I think 1805, 1806, when Napoleon gets rid of the French Republican calendar. And by that time, nobody's using it anyway. And so the bourgeoisie really is reasserting control there. So I would say that really the sans-culottes, they have their day in the sun with the reign of terror and the radical phase and all of that kind of stuff. But afterwards, like by the end of the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie has ended up being the dominant class. And that's why, when you read Karl Marx, it's like he's talking about the bourgeoisie. It's like the bourgeoisie, these are the bad people to Karl Marx, because the nobility and the church have really ceased to be on top, and it's these it's the bourgeois capitalists, the business folks that have established themselves on the top of the social ladder. The Congress of Vienna, I typically do that as the beginning of my unit on the isms and stuff. Like, you know, which you could do either one. I think the Congress of Vienna is an end or a beginning. I personally think that it works better at the beginning of the unit on the isms because it sets up conservatism. And of course, by this time, like with my class this year, I've spent a lot of time talking about classical liberalism while we're talking about the French Revolution. And so, and the thing is, Emily, the biggest thing, like your textbook, you know, do it how you want to do it. Like if you do it at the end of the French Revolution, that's fine. But yeah, I would go with putting that in the ideologies in the 19th century because I look at it as more of a beginning because they're setting up the order that's going to dominate Europe between 1815 and 1848. So that would be my thing there. All right. So the Enlightenment, all right, the scientific revolution. Now, one thing that I'm working on right now is Pascal's wager. Okay, and the thing is, what intrigues me about you know, the scientific revolution is a lot of these folks were they were still religious. You know, it's like Descartes, he was skeptical, okay? But once he doubted and once he questioned, Descartes said, I'm still a Catholic. I'm still convinced of the truth of the Catholic faith. And while Blaise Pascal was a Catholic heretic, he was a Jansenist. I want to do a video on the Jansenist at some point. This was a kind of, I mean, it wasn't, they still claimed to be part of the Catholic Church, but it was almost like a Calvinist influenced Catholicism. Like they were, they had a lesser role assigned to free will. But anyway, with that, Blaise Pascal with Pascal's wager, that Pascal, you know, with the scientific revolution, you can no longer take it as a given that God exists, all right, because we can't prove it. So when you think about the scientific method, we can't prove that God exists. And so Pascal comes up with this wager that he's like, well, the thing is, if God exists, if the Christian God exists, and I believe, then I get an eternity in heaven. And so with that, I've got this like eternal life. Let's see the other choices. Well, if God doesn't exist, like if God doesn't exist and I live my life as a Christian, well, the worst that happened was I was a little bit better of a person. Okay. I was actually a decent person. So what did I really lose there except for the ability to do everything I wanted and to sin in this life? Then if I didn't believe in God and God didn't exist, then dirt nap, just like, you know, I mean, if God doesn't exist, I'm taking a dirt nap anyway. And so all I got was to live this life the way that I wanted to. And so I got something finite. And then the problem Pascal sees is if God does exist, you know, it's like you get either a finite, you know, reward or an infinite reward or an infinite punishment. And so Pascal put this into like some very interesting, like sort of rational-esque kind of terms. But at the same time, he was still a Christian. You know, Newton spent more time writing about religion than he did about, you know, about writing about physics and stuff like that. So this is the thing, like, you know, Galileo recanted, you know, when the church put him under pressure because he was a devout Catholic. And so the thing is, the Enlightenment is kind of the next phase of this, that it's building on that foundation of the scientific revolution and saying, you know, we need more scientific thinking just in life. And so these people were much more likely to just be skeptics in terms of, you know, the Christian religion, because ultimately, when it comes down to it, the Christian religion is a religion that does not have, it's not provable, okay? And there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that you're just like, I've never seen anything like that happen before, empiricism. Now, I say this as a practicing Christian, okay? So the thing is, I mean, I freely admit, yes, there is a level of faith involved. There is a level of just, you know, hey, I mean, some of it is absurd, you know, if you think about it, but religion is not a rational thing. So the Enlightenment is like full-blown rationality. Like we really need to have a more rational approach to life in general. And that's where you get the religion of deism, that when you think about it, like without any religious teaching, I could step outside, I could look around, I could come to the conclusion that, there's in all probability some kind of higher power that designed all this stuff. I can do that perfectly reasonably. And that's an example of the of deism, this religious mindset that was common among the Enlightenment philosophers. And so the Enlightenment philosophers really, I compare this to Galileo. Galileo ticked off the church, but he didn't mean to. Voltaire ticked off the church and he meant to. All right. So that's really the big difference for me. And so that's where, when we think about Enlightenment philosophy and the skepticism about the Christian religion that came along with that, I think that that's something that we can certainly put as a causal factor for the French Revolution, and that's actually, a good LEQ prompt, to what extent were Enlightenment ideals responsible for the French Revolution? Something to think about. Now, so the Peace of Augsburg. Now, the Peace of Augsburg was during the Reformation, and that's what said, basically, remember that Charles V, a devout Catholic, his initial response to Martin Luther was that no, not even doing that. Everybody's Catholic in the Holy Roman Empire. And then there were some wars fought that you don't need to know about, but there was some fighting in the Holy Roman Empire. And then finally, the Peace of Augsburg said, look, whoever reigns his religion, that whoever the local prince is in the Holy Roman Empire, which they had over 300 principalities, whatever religion the local prince is, that's what's going to go in that principality. Whoever reigns his religion. So that's the Peace of Augsburg. Now, remember that the Peace of Westphalia actually brought that up another notch. It added Calvinism to that, because what happened, part of the reason for the 30 Years' War was that there were a lot of pockets of Calvinists in the Holy Roman Empire who were stirring things up and causing trouble, largely because their religion wasn't, strictly speaking, legal. And so the Edict of Restitution, without trying to look it up, this is something you're much less likely to see on an exam, I think, than the Peace of Augsburg. But the Edict of Restitution was, at the high point for the Catholics of the 30 Years' War. There was a great meme that I saw, AP Euro memes. I re-memed it on Instagram, where the football players say, I'm not going to lie, they had us in the first half. I mean, this is the 30 Years' War. So it's after the initial, the first two phases of the 30 Years' War before Sweden intervened, were very much on the side of the Catholics. And the Edict of Restitution was basically, it was a way, the Holy Roman Emperor was making sure that territories that had fallen into Protestant hands were given back to the Catholics. But again, I don't know if I've ever seen the Edict of Restitution specifically mentioned on an exam, in the sense that, you might have seen, in a DBQ, you might see some kind of reference to it or something like that. But that is in the 30 Years' War, that's to make sure that all Catholic lands were given back to Catholics, that's not, that's happening. All right. How much did foreign involvement affect the French Revolution? Quite a bit, because really what's going on here now, whenever it comes to wartime, governments always get more power during wartime. There's always more of a paranoid sort of footing. I always wonder, when historians look back at this time in our nation's history, I remember what it was like to have peacetime, to actually, in the 1990s, that the United States was at peace, which students today, a lot of y'all were born, it's 2018 now, a lot of y'all don't, you don't ever know. Emily, what do you think about this? I mean, some of these students, somebody mentioned this to me the other day, that students today have never experienced a period of peace in United States history where we felt safe, where we felt, we're not at war, we don't have troops dying overseas. And that affects how people think. I mean, if you look at the United States today, I think that it's something that like the way people treat each other right now. Like when I was in high school, yeah, it's like, somebody's a Democrat, somebody's a Republican. It didn't stop people from hanging out together. Like that's what I mean, if I can get on my soapbox for just a second here, it's just that we've gotten to a point where people with strong political opinions, like they take it for granted. Like I can't have friends that are progressives, or I can't have friends that are Trump supporters because these people are dangerous and that sort of thing. And that sort of mentality, I wonder if historians will look at this period, and we don't know, we can't write history right now. And will historians look back at this period and connect like the war on terror and what's going on with that and how that's been so ongoing and the global situation and what we are experiencing right now? Okay. So, for example, like when you think about like, Muslim immigration is a hot topic right now. Well, if it weren't for the war on terror, that would not be nearly as hot button of an issue. And so, as far as that, yeah, I think that's certainly, we see, and when people, the other side of that is when people don't participate, they choose not to participate in those patriotic ceremonies. A lot of negative attention, happens to that for that person. And so the thing is, yeah, I think that's definitely like this country is different than the country that I grew up in. So with the French Revolution, understand that from 1792 on, France is at war this entire time. And so when they're dealing with their guillotining people, they're thinking in terms of, we have to do this for the survival of the nation. Like when you had the September massacres, where they basically went into the prisons in Paris, and their thought was that if the Prussians get to Paris, then they're going to let these prisoners out, and these prisoners are going to fight for the Prussians. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're going to massacre the prisoners. And that's the way that they're thinking. So I think that definitely made a difference there. And of course, you've got the thing with the British as well. So when you get to Napoleon, the British are definitely a big deal in that phase of the revolution and in defeating Napoleon ultimately. Yeah, I do think, yeah, you definitely do need to know the old regime. And what I was talking about earlier, Matt, with the three estates, not only the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the third, but also knowing these three parts of the third estate, that the third estate was made up of the bourgeoisie, the sans-culottes, and the peasantry, and realizing that all three of those groups had their own interests. So what you're really looking at, I would say, are five. You've got three estates, but I would say you've got five groups of people here: the clergy, the nobility, the bourgeoisie, the sans-culottes, and the peasantry. So yes, I think that's definitely important. If you ended up having to write an essay on the French Revolution, especially important. Did religion affect the revolution at all? Yes. Okay, that's an easy question there. Now, when you get to the reign of, so first of all, you've got the civil constitution of the clergy that basically tries to turn the French Catholic Church into a national church. Not too different than, I mean, a lot of this looks like what Henry VIII did during the English Reformation is what they're trying to do there. But then when you get into the radical phase of the French Revolution, they get rid of the civil constitution of the clergy, they de-Christianize. Like they decide that, and that's where this really I don't know if I'd call it Enlightenment philosophy, but it's like a frenzy. It's almost like later on, people talk about to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy influence Hitler. And the thing is, there's not a direct connection between Nietzsche and Hitler, but you could see where Hitler could read Nietzsche and get things out of his work that okay, then he could do that. And Nietzsche's sister was an admirer of Adolf Hitler. But the thing is that that's just not that's not something. I wouldn't say that the philosophes would have gone that far in order to de-Christianize, and enforce that from the state's perspective. But yes, I mean, during the Reign of Terror, like, Christianity became illegal, and they had this, Robespierre had his cult of the supreme being. Now, of course, Napoleon, with the Concordat of 1801, brought Catholicism back as the majority religion. And the thing is that it's maybe a little bit somewhere between a state religion and because if we think about it, like, in the United States today, I mean, Christianity is the majority religion. Now, does it necessarily get preference at state functions and stuff like that? No, but basically, that Catholicism had like a symbolic role in the French government after that, but never again the role of a state religion collecting tithes and all of that kind of stuff. And so who led the British troops against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo? That would be Arthur Wellesley, the Iron Duke of Wellington. So yeah, the Duke of Wellington. And also, if you're into that sort of thing, you also want to know Admiral Lord Nelson, Horatio Nelson, who defeated the French Navy at the Battle of the Nile and again at the Battle of Trafalgar, where he died in that battle. And so that's what kept Napoleon from being able to invade Britain. Okay, so that's what you're looking at there. What impact did Napoleon? Okay, so before that, I mean, now I need to read this book that I've got over here. But Napoleon was working his way, his way up. Let's see, during the French Revolution. Now, Napoleon was born to minor Corsican nobility. And so with that in mind, being born to minor Corsican nobility, if it hadn't been for the French Revolution, Napoleon might have risen to the rank of like captain or something like that. And Napoleon, though, with the wars that were going on, he advanced up the ranks very quickly. Now, he also went into artillery. And this was something that was very important. If any of y'all are into playing like video games, like war video games, there's like, I played Empire Total War before, and you can see like artillery, it's just so important on the battlefield at that time. And so Napoleon, now the other thing is Napoleon got politically involved, got politically connected, and he realized that it wasn't just about what kind of general you were, but it's about who you know, who your connections are. And of course, he kind of made his name by putting down a royalist uprising with, what is attributed to him, at least, saying he gave him a whiff of grape shot, that he was the guy that was willing to fire into a crowd. And so that endeared him to some of the people who wanted to make sure that this royalist uprising was put down. All right. And Domo, I think I've already answered this question. That now, remember, what you're looking for here is LED. The only time LEAD spells lead you're looking for lead. The only time LEAD spells lead is when you're talking about the metal. Other than that, it's always LED. So common mistake, though. Common mistake. I'm teaching you right now. So the factors that led to the French Revolution, you've got, first of all, the financial crisis. And how was the financial crisis dealt with? It wasn't. All right. When the Assembly of Notables was called, then there you go. That's it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if y'all can think of a short video that I could make for Fiveable explaining something, go ahead and put that in the comments. I'm talking about like a video, like a 5-minute or less video. If there's a specific topic that I might be able to explain to you on Fiveable's YouTube channel, go ahead and put that in the comments if you have any suggestions for that. Not necessarily like the thorough kind of videos that I do for my channel, but something that would kind of give, okay, this would help me a little bit. Let me know. But as far as that, you've got the financial crisis. All right. Also, you've got, Louis's own indecision. And that is, of course, just kind of a failure of personal leadership. Now, the other things, I don't know if I'd necessarily call these things problems with, all of that kind of stuff. So Yeah, so I may do something with that. Okay, but I wonder if I may put that on my own YouTube channel. That's where I'm kind of like fighting sometimes and trying to figure out. But I'll think of something that I'll put on Fiveable's channel for the month. I try to make a video for them, typically one a month. So with that, we've got pretty much, I think everybody's questions have been answered, and I think that when we come back here in 2 weeks, we'll see some more people that are studying the French Revolution. Tonight, most people, about 80%, weren't at the French Revolution yet. Now, remember, we're going to take a week off for Thanksgiving. So everybody have a happy Thanksgiving next week. And I will see y'all again in 2 weeks. And that is going to be on November 28th. And I'm looking forward to seeing y'all then. And y'all have a wonderful night. And it's always a pleasure. You're very welcome, Nora, and happy Turkey Day to you, Emily, and everybody else in here.